can you close the door, please? I say there is a certain difficulty regarding this seminar because the texts which we must read are much more difficult to read than the ones we read usually, for example, in Locke. Even there are very difficulties to Locke. But I think every reader of normal intelligence reading 10 pages in Locke, whichever they may be, they can give an account of what he read without too great difficulty. Superficial account, misleading account, and still some account. In the case of Kant, that is by no means so easy. So what shall I do? I will try to distribute some papers if I get any takers. Now, today I will give a general introduction. I hope I can finish it today. If not, I may need the next meeting and the paper will be a bit later. But we have to be cautious in our estimates. Now, the first text we have to read will be the introduction to the Prolegomenon. This is the Kant Prolegomenon, well, that's the modern library. And this introduction is about 10 pages in the modern library edition. That should be ready Wednesday, but it may be necessary only next Monday. Who is willing to take that? Well, I'm still in a high school. All right, then I give thank you, Mr. Hobbes. Yeah, I do not know what you know. Read German, I know.
Yes.
That is, of course, wiser if you would read it in German.
Yes, I read in German.
Have you ever read Kant before?
Yes, but not in German.
Huh?
Not in German. But all of it kind of in English.
Oh, strange. Good. So, all right. I can only make this suggestion, but this I do with great trembling. If you could find the time to read also the two prefaces to the Critique of Pure Reason, would be better. But you are under no obligation. The item to which we turn then is Kant's essay called Ideas for Universal History. Or how does the idea of universal, how does he translate? Idea for Universal History with Cosmopolitan Intent, that is also in the modern library edition. That would be due next Monday at the earliest. Who would be willing to do that? 16 pages text. Again, I would say in this case, if the student who does it would read German, he should read two other writings on the philosophy of history by Kant, also short, one on a critique of Herder's philosophy of history, and another on the substantive origin of human history, of the history of mankind, which are not conveniently available in English translation. Now, who is willing to read this paper on the idea for universal history? Well, then I indicate the other papers, and I hope someone will make up his mind by next Wednesday. The fourth subject we would read is Theory and Practice. That is also in the Modern Library edition, to which one should add an article called The Principle of Progress, which you find in English translation in Kant, Eternal Peace, translated by Hastie, Hastie, of which there is a copy in this university library. That's number 4. Number 5 is an essay called Public Law. In this same edition of Eternal Peace by Hastie, pages 131 to 168. I asked those of you who take this course for credit to take down the notes. I refuse to repeat the data individually. I cannot do that. So those who are interested in the course could be so kind to take that trouble. Public Law in Eternal Peace, edited by Hastie, pages 131 to 168. That is a section from Kant's Metaphysics of Morals. And then we come to Kant's Perpetual Peace, which you find a complete translation in the Liberal Arts in the Little Library of Liberal Arts, we discussed in one meeting the text, the body of this book. And in the seventh meeting, Perpetual Peace, the supplements, the things which are called by Kant Zusätze, or in English translation, supplements. That's about 20 pages is the body, and more than 20 pages the supplements. That is numbers per meeting 6 and 7. Now, in the 8th meeting, we have to discuss a few points in the critique of pure reason, and then I will do this in the form of a discussion with you of certain selected texts from the critique of pure reason. We do not need a paper with that. And then in meetings 9 to 13, we plan to discuss the fundamental principles of the foundations of morals, of the metaphysics of morals, which is also available in complete translation in the Little Library of Liberal Arts. The last 3 meetings, I thought we read selected passages from the critique of practical reason and the critique of judgment. Now, this all presupposes that the difficulties are not such as to compel us to stop at certain points and to devote more than one meeting to a given subject, contrary to what I tentatively assume. We are not, after all, in a very great hurry. We want to understand something, and if we understand better by sticking to 40 pages of time, we may very well do so. But we do need some overall understanding of Kant's overall intention. So I hope that those of you who take this course for credit will give some thought to the question of papers and let me know at the beginning of the next meeting. Unless someone changed his mind.
So take the 4th meeting, I think it's theory of practice.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Hook. Now I turn to an introduction. The seminar is meant to deal primarily with Kant's philosophy of history. I will explain the problem, and I will also explain why it is reasonable to begin the study of Kant, or our study here of Kant, with his philosophy of history. Now, let us begin at the beginning. When we read today a social science study, and are not completely drowned by certain conventions, we apply the following canon of criticism, I think. Apart from the ordinary canons of criticism, is it clear, is it coherent, and so on and so on. Namely, whether the author does not fiddle while Rome burns. Whenever we come across such a book, our interest decreases enormously. Now, what does this mean? We mean this, that no one can be an intelligent and competent student of society, our society, unless he is aware of the crisis of our time. If he is unaware of it, if he takes for granted that we have centuries and centuries in order to build up a perfect picture of the power structure of the state of Montana, then there is something wrong with that man. Now, such awareness of the crisis of our time implies that we recognize the peculiar character of that crisis as distinguished from other crises. It presupposes a historical perspective, historical self-consciousness, being aware of ourselves as belonging to a peculiar time. This historical self-consciousness seems to be the beginning of any possible wisdom. Philosophizing, to may use that word, seems to be radically historical. Now, this view has a great plausibility today, and it is very hard to hit on some solid ground before one can raise any objection to it. One can say that those who lack that historical self-consciousness, or are not animated by it, do not fulfill the requirement necessary today of a serious discussion. And I would assert this as simply true. If one comes across a present-day writer who shows no awareness of that, I'm speaking now of a writer in the social sciences, not in mathematics, then we know there's something wrong with that man. And there is still a difficulty here of which we must remind ourselves immediately. Namely, in the past, all philosophers was non-historical. Is not philosophy essentially non-historical, concerned exclusively with the essential and the permanent, rather than with the transitory and ephemeral? Now here we must make a distinction, namely the distinction between modern and pre-modern philosophy. Modern philosophy, at least from a certain moment on, and it is very hard to say whether this moment does not coincide with the very beginning of modern philosophy. Modern philosophy was philosophically concerned with history, and more particularly with a historical situation in which the philosopher philosophizes. Fairly late was it explicitly said by Hegel that every philosopher is a son of his time. Today that's true, but it took such a long time until Hegel said that. And Hegel meant by this that not only does he wear the ties or the shirts belonging to that time, that was of course always known, but that in his philosophizing he's essentially the son of his time. That is a phenomenon peculiar to modern philosophy. The external sign of this is a very simple fact. The term philosophy of history is only about 200 years old. As far as I have been able to find out, it was coined by Voltaire in 751. So that if we are strict, or if you please pedantic, we must say a philosophy of history as such does not exist prior to 1750, which doesn't mean that some things which one may call philosophy of history exist before, but they were not themselves necessarily philosophy of history. Now, the question which I have in mind is this. There is a crisis. The crisis of our time. Is this crisis not the crisis of modern thought as such? Namely, does the crisis not consist in the collapse of beliefs which were held by modern man for some centuries, and by the ensuing lack of orientation? Now let us state this general philosophical problem in a somewhat different way. Philosophy of history, what did it mean when Voltaire coined the word? A recent study of history, i.e. of records of the past. Today, philosophy of history means very frequently, and it certainly means that in Hegel, the understanding not of reports, of records, but of a dimension of reality. When people speak of philosophy of history, they frequently mean by history something analogous to nature. Philosophy of nature is not the philosophy of the study of nature. Similarly, philosophy of history is not the study, the philosophy of human concern with history, but of something which is also called, since Hegel, the historical process. It's a very strange thing. Let us begin What is the original meaning of history? It's a Greek word. It means something like the verb means inquire, make inquiries. From this point of view, what a scientist does is, of course, also history. You know, the term natural history was still used in my childhood for the description of plants and animals. I don't know whether this was common when you went to school. That was certainly a very common meaning. Samuel Aristotle, very massive in Bacon and so on. So history means originally inquiry. But it took on very early, it seems, a special meaning. I mean, such inquiries as are inquiries with human beings. If you make an inquiry about an animal, you do not necessarily ask people about that beast you want to study. You look at that beast, you dissect it and so on. That's the true inquiry of that beast. But there are other things in which you cannot possibly find out the truth except by inquiring with people. For example, what happened when you were very, very young, or when you were not yet born? You cannot possibly know, except by inquiring with older people. And the step from inquiring with people who are older than you to people who lived generations before you is easy to take. Because if you look up old files or old letters of people generations before you, you do fundamentally the same as if you ask your grandfather about what happened in his village or wherever it was 70 years ago. So, at any rate, the term history took on this meaning of inquiring with other people, and therefore the study of such things, the truth regarding which can only be found by inquiring with other people. We may loosely say, or not so loosely, the study of human actions and human speeches and human thoughts. Loosely, the study of important events. Important events can be understood as important changes in human affairs. Because if things do not change, we only don't speak of events. The most famous Greek historian, Thucydides, describes the subject matter of his work as a change, very emphatically, kinesis. Changes in institutions, in laws, in thoughts, in beliefs, and so on. And therefore also history can come to mean the study of those laws, institutions, beliefs, and so on, qua changed, i.e., qua having come into being. Now, philosophy of history, as it is now understood, means that these changes form an ordered sequence. An ordered sequence. There is the accidental and the chance occurrence. But the accidental is subordinated to the lawful or orderly or meaningful. That is a necessary indication of philosophy of history. This notion had emerged in the modern centuries. I will speak of this in somewhat very detail later. And it was became questioned generally by the precise historical research which began in the second half of the 19th century. And so some people made remarks to the effect, and British historian, that he would feel very badly if he were compelled to charge a fellow historian with having a philosophy of history. In other words, it is no sober study of the past entitles one to speak of an ordered sequence in the sense in which a philosophy of history asserts. But something else emerged, which is of more immediate importance to us today than the philosophy of history. And this is the following point, which an opinion, a view, which I will call, as it is frequently called, at least in continental Europe, historicism. Now, historicism does not necessarily say that the historical changes form an ordered sequence. But what necessarily says is this, that man, every man, is radically dependent in his most human on the place he finds himself in that sequence, regardless of whether the sequence is orderly or not. The individual is a son of his time, historicism says together with Hegel. But whereas Hegel meant that the sequence of times is a meaningful whole, and therefore there was no danger in being the son of your time, because that made you a member of a rational whole, the whole rational, meaningful, orderly process. Historicism as such takes away this conflict. We radically depend on something which is simply mysterious and cannot be conceived of in terms of human reason. In the simplest form, I can say this view as follows. All human thought depends fundamentally on premises which appear to a given time or to a given type of man as evident, but which are unevident to all of them. They are not truly evident. Not truly, that's to say, absolutely evident. They are evident only by virtue of a peculiar dispensation of fate. The term fate is here absolutely necessary. The term fate implies that this thing on which we ultimately depend is not analyzable anymore. Because every analysis, say in terms of social or economic conditions or what have you, are based on certain fundamental premises, which premises are not rational, not evident. Is this point clear? Yes.
Well, what about the view of historicity that you can only understand?
Pardon?
What about the historicist view that you can only understand an age in the past? You can only understand the age when you have gotten out of it. Such a person as Carl Becker.
Yeah, I think Becker, that was a very initial and groping form of historicism, halfway in every respect. Because the question simply arises, what does understanding of the past mean? All understanding prior to the study of your books, or your historical documents, rests on certain points of view, doesn't it? I mean, that Becker knew. Said, if I remember that. So the point of view from which he selects his themes. This point of view has its root in the present. Yeah? Let us take this simple formula. Yeah? Good. Why is this point of view so evident? The point of view from which he studies the past. The point of view from which he selects his themes and therefore his sources.
That is precisely what he denies his evidence.
What?
That the assumptions of the time are evidence. That you only perceive them.
Oh, I see.
When you have...
All right. Then I misunderstood you. Then it is more... yeah, but still. But on the other hand, no one could perhaps say this. That is one way of putting it. You know, that your true premises are unevident in such a way that you cannot even know them. That's one way. The other way is to say you can be aware of them, but they are so evident to you that they cannot become a problem. Take a simple example for all of us to begin with. Whether we know anything of that or not doesn't make any difference. Science is the greatest authority today. The authority which everyone has to admit. Yeah? No one can possibly say whether, say, 200 years from now that will still be true. It's impossible to say. Because that, you know what could happen? It's impossible. So we know that this science, can perhaps give a very good internal analysis of science. You know what its methods, its premises are and what not. And yet its authoritative character, which is so evident to us to begin with, may have given way to something entirely different. No one can know that. So I think you made it clearer. So one thing, of course, that is perfectly true. The basic premises may not even be knowable to a given time, but then they are, of course, unevident in the highest possible degree. Yeah. But the main point of historicism is that all thought, of human thought, rests on premises different for different historical situations, which are essentially unevident, and which, even if they are known, cannot possibly be explained in, say, economic or social or whatnot, or racial terms, because every explanation rests on fundamental premises, which fundamental premises are exactly those historical premises imposed by faith. This is by no means the theme of this course to discuss historicism. I only have to mention this problem here because this indicates a part of the reason why a study of the philosophy of history is necessary. Because the historicistic position as we know it today, and as it affects all academic men, with the exception of the pure positivists, to some degree. This is an outgrowth of the philosophy of history. In the moment the orderly character, the rational character of the historical process became questionable, men had no choice, so to speak, except to say the dependence of man, of the individual, on the spirit of the times. That's an undeniable fact. That far from saving the individual thought, because he belongs to an ordered whole, shows our terrible lostness. We depend ultimately on principles, premises, which we cannot help admitting, and yet they are not truly evident. That's one way of putting it. Or perhaps even we cannot know them, which would be another way of, would be the same thing. Now, we have to, we would like to study this strange thing, this concern with history, this historical consciousness, to use a phrase of German origin. This much about the purpose. Now let us really begin, as reasonable people do, at the surface. And if there is a surface of the surface, which is not a very felicitous expression, but you will forgive me, let's by all means begin with the surface of the surface. What is that surface of the surface? In our case, I do not hesitate to say Charles Beard's introduction to Burley's The Idea of Progress, an inquiry into its origin and growth. One historical fact is of some interest. This introduction was written in the year 1932. Some people will say that this date is fully excused Beard. But I'm fully excused because he could not possibly foresee in 1933. But we are perhaps entitled to demand a bit more foresight of a man who wants to be a teacher, an academic teacher. But let us see, and let us read a few passages. Philosophy of history. The very phrase is a flag over debated ground. It means the investigation of the rational principles which it is assumed are disclosed in the historical process due to the cooperation and the interaction of human minds and the terrestrial conditions. If the philosophy of history is not illusory, history means a disclosure of spiritual reality in the fullest way in which it is cognizable to us in these particular conditions. And on the other hand, the possibility of an interpretation of history as a movement of reason, disclosing its nature in terrestrial circumstances, seems the only hypothesis on which the postulate of history for its own sake can be justified as valid. This is a simplistic restatement of Hegel, we can say. The only justification in the eyes of an intelligent man of the study of history, as a study conducted with full dedication, history for its own sake, is possible only if the history is the movement of reason. Who would be interested in the casual consequences of crimes and follies? Now, philosophy of history is essentially related then to the notion of a progress of reason, or to use a more simple term, progress. History is a history of progress, no, it doesn't make sense. He quotes here the clue, quoting here a passage from Bird, he says, a clue to the mystery of history is to be found in the concept of development or progress. If so, then that is evidently a discovery as important as human mind has ever made, with implications for mankind that almost transcend imagination. Progress of reason was here understood in these halcyon times as a part of a universal progress. And this universal progress was called evolution. In other words, in the 19th century, some confluence of the idea of history, of progress, and of the idea of biological evolution had taken place, and that seemed to be the clarifying discovery. There is, however, this difficulty as to which Bird refers. Science tells us that apart from the incalculable chances of catastrophes, man has still myriads and myriads of years to live on this planet under physical conditions which need not hinder his development or impair his energies. That is a period of which his whole recorded history of 6,000 or 7,000 years is a small fraction. End of the quote. In other words, there is a slight difficulty. We have the notion of infinite progress, where it's very bad that we do not have any choice. And so what I wanted to paint is something extremely simple. A straight line. You will take the idea, won't you? Good. You know, it's infinite. But we know that it's an end somewhere. But that is so far away that a sensible man would not worry about that for one moment. And so there might be the incalculable chances of earlier catastrophes. And that is another point. Bury refers to the dark imminence of this unknown future in front of us. Now, if the progress is such a certainty, one could not possibly speak of the dark imminence, but one would say the future indeed is unknown, but it can only be bright. Now, Bird is dissatisfied with this remark. He thinks it much too harsh. And why? Bird has not one justice to one phenomenon when we spoke of the progress of reason, and that is technology. Technology. Of all the ideas pertinent to the concept of progress, to the interpretation of what has gone on during the past 200 years and is going on in the world, none is more relevant than technology. And he speaks to the same effect later. The main point that I must read briefly. Technology, by its intrinsic nature, transcends all historical forms, the whole heritage of acquired institutions and habits. It serves with impartiality Japanese samurai, American industrialists, and the Russian Soviet state. Universal in its reach, it cannot be monopolized by any nation, class, period, government, or people. In Catholicity, it surpasses all religion as an instrument of work engaging human energies in a manner far surpassing the lure of war, as a social dissolvent and readjuster, and as a philosophy of action. Technology must be brought into the mainstream of history. If the course of history is to be surveyed correctly, and, quote, the dark imminence of the unknown future, unquote, is to be in any way penetrated. Technology, in other words, is a capstone of the philosophy of history or of the idea of progress. Very had a sober belief in progress, but this fades into insignificance with Charles Peirce's belief in progress. However, there is one little speck, and that speck was not the Soviet state. Of course, the Japanese samurai were probably condemned to extinction by progress already at that time. And that is this. In the idea of progress, there is inevitably an ethical element. It implies that the stream of history flows in a desirable direction on the whole. And at once we are plunged in the middle of ethics. Immediately a fixed point of reference, benchmark, must be set up from which to determine whether the movement of history is in a desirable direction and or not. That leads to other difficulties. I can leave it at that. Because Beer does not speak of it, but you know from your own knowledge that this 1932 was about the time in which a certain notion came to this country from continental Europe at the time when this building was built, more or less. And that was the notion that science is essentially value-free. That it is impossible to say anything rationally about what is good and bad. Now, if that is impossible, of course, it is absolutely impossible for a self-respecting scientist to speak of progress. In very limited ways, he can say there is of course there is a progress in the building of airplanes, because the present airplanes are more comfortable, faster, and more safe than other airplanes, sure. But given these premises, which someone could very well say, uncomfortable, unsafe, and slow airplanes are much better and you couldn't argue with it. No. So, in other words, in the moment the problem of values became a serious issue for social scientists, they could not speak anymore of progress. And the proof, I think, is obvious. Who speaks of progress now? The term is change, social change. Progress has, with this victory of value-free social science, progress has lost its status. Beer didn't see the issue at all. I mean, this issue which was so close home in academic halls and not far away in Europe or in Soviet Union. Now let us summarize the observations which we might have made by looking at the surface of the surface. Philosophy of history. That means that the history of mankind, generally speaking, consists in an ever-improved use of reason. But this progress of reason eventually makes doubtful reason itself for what is the meaning of the related recognition since the last decade of the 19th century that the highest form of reason, science, is incapable to distinguish between good and bad. So the progress of reason culminates in, and now I use the Kantian term, a critique of reason. Perhaps that's the first opportunity I have, and even a necessity I mean to refer to Kant. Are we then compelled to say that the highest achievement of reason is the critique of reason, and especially that post-Kantian form of the critique of reason, which says reason is incapable to distinguish between good and bad? Yet, to which one can provisionally answer, perhaps it is not. It is only a certain understanding of reason which first led to the idea of progress, and thereafter to the self-destruction of reason. Perhaps that understanding of reason underlying this modern development is altogether questioned. Now, we should perhaps say a few words based on this idea of progress. Burry's book is useful, it is superficial, but it is not grossly misleading. It points out to you the books which you would have to study in order to find out what precisely the idea of progress is. And there are some remarks which are quite helpful. Now, I will try to summarize Beatrice as far as it's relevant for us in a few words. The idea of progress emerged among the Greeks, but among the Greeks only in a very rudimentary and half-hearted form. The real epoch of the idea of progress is the modern epoch, 16th century, and so on. Now, what were the points where the classical notion of progress was effective? The ancients knew, and I disregard now whether every point is made by Burry or not, that's not important. The Greeks knew the possibility of an infinite progress in the arts, or at least in certain arts. Take medicine. There is always a possibility of greater refinement regarding treatment, regarding the treatment of diseases which hitherto have not responded to treatment, and so on and so on. There was very clearly an existence, say, in the time of the Peloponnesian War, a certainty of progress achieved beyond the ancient or olden times. When you read into theories, for example, you get this kind of remarks which you would find later on in the 17th, 18th century. We are much superior in power as well as in understanding to our fathers and grandfathers. At least the best man among us is the best man in the generation of our grandfathers. The question, of course, is this: can this be progress achieved? It does not necessarily prove infinite or indefinite. And here is where the limitation of the Greek concept of progress comes in. In the first place, the suspicion, the conviction that progress will be followed by decline. Take the analogy of the human body. To to some extent even of the human mind, progress, growth, followed by decay. The fact that frequently observed that in most societies precisely after a very glorious period, a kind of lethargy, slackening comes in. In Athens, in Socrates, in Plato's day, he was quite sure that he had been born late, at a late time in his fatherland, by which he probably meant Athens does no longer have a future, as we would put it today. You only have anyone who has been in France knows very well what this means, and even a precise analysis, so-called scientific analysis, would bring out some facts which would confirm it for him who needs confirmation. So, in other words, but apart from that, and ultimately more important, the fact that there would surely be catastrophes, natural cataclysms, which would put an end to all civilization. And then there might again be a new civilization beginning from these root mountaineers who survived the cataclysm from the side. So, in other words, there was no, and also the periods, we speak today of billions of years the Earth lasted. The numbers which the classics mentioned regarding the duration of human life, undisturbed human life on Earth, were much shorter numbers. I remember now, I haven't looked it up, 75,000 years is a fairly high number, which affects, of course, the perspective of powerful men, not of men who do not think beyond their grandchildren or so. But the more important point, I believe, is this. For Greek thought on its highest level, as represented by such men as Plato and Aristotle, there was no connection whatever between intellectual progress and social progress. Connection whatever is an overstatement. There was no essential connection. The classic passage on this subject is the second book of Aristotle's Politics, where he discusses hypothalamus. And the point which he makes there is this. I state it roughly as follows. To disturb settled opinion is of the essence of the intellect, to question, to ask questions, to raise doubts. But this which is so natural and so necessary to the intellect as intellect is a very grave danger to society. The intellect as intellect cannot have this concern with stability which society must necessarily have. Now, I will not, because I think that you can read Burley's book yourself, and I do not have to go into that. I will only say, mention a few points which are crucial. Yeah, and this is around the period from Burley. There was a fantastic fellow in the 18th century. I mean, not a thinker in any way, but a symptomatic man. There was Abbé Saint-Pierre, who was respected to some extent by such a man as Rousseau, and therefore influenced this way Kant. He was concerned with Perpetual Peace and all of that. But I'm now concerned only with what the Abbé Saint-Pierre teaches regarding progress, because I believe that is really the simplest and the very clear statement, The first point. It was said already long before Abbé Saint-Pierre that the intellectual progress necessarily leads to social progress. On the basis of this further consideration, if a man has discovered the truth, this discovery cannot help becoming public sooner or later. with changing the public mind, public opinion, and therefore making the public mind more closer to the truth, in this sense more intelligent. Now, what I find is the peculiar contribution of Hervé Saint-Pierre is this. He starts from the observation that a high school boy can now, in the 18th century, or for that matter in the 20th century, easily solve problems which could be solved in the past only by the greatest genius. Think of the enormous genius required for discovering analytic geometry or the calculus. Descartes, Newton, today, an intelligent high school or college boy mastered it. Hence, that was the conclusion of W. Saint-Pierre. We are much more intelligent than the past. How did this come about? The substitution, we can say, of method for intelligence problem. The magic of method consists precisely in this, that you can learn certain operations, and then by mastering these operations you can solve all kinds of problems which originally required a very great effort of the intelligence to solve. Method levels the mind. Something of this kind was said by Bacon and in other way by Descartes. So the intellectual level of man can enormously be increased by the discovery of method. The second point which I would like to mention regarding the Abbé de Saint-Pierre is this. He assumed that the world has a beginning. Human life, the world has a beginning in time. Roughly the biblical chronology says 6,000-7,000 years. But while being finite as far as the past is concerned, the duration of the world is infinite regarding the future. Then infinite progress is certainly assured. And this permits him only to argue as follows, and that was no longer simply biblical. The beginnings were absolutely imperfect. Savages, roaming in the forest. And now he looked around in 18th century, look how well clothed, well fed, well housed we are, and how intelligent mathematics, the economic system, and so on. In this short time of 7,000 years, you make a proportion. 1 to 7,000 equal to 7,000 to infinite, and you can see that there is absolutely no possible limit of human progress. It is, I think I admire the argument for this reason, because he stated so simply the absolutely necessary cosmological premise of infinite progress strictly understood. A beginning apart the answer past, and no end, and the certainty of no end apart the post. In the moment this assumption becomes questionable, it is hard to speak of infinite progress in precise language. Yeah, well, I do not have, of course, this other point must be mentioned, which is crucial, and which is really underlines this premise, this minor premise which I mentioned, that science, the result of science, become necessarily common property in the course of generations. That is prepared, this premise is prepared by a new understanding of the meaning of science. Science for the sake of power, as Bacon and Hobbes put it. Science serves the purpose of making man the master and owner of nature. Science does no longer have a purely theoretical purpose, as it had in the pre-modern view, but it serves the needs of man, and therefore, of course, it must be communicated. Therefore, because science is for the sake of power, there is necessarily a harmony between philosophy and or science and society. the progress of science or philosophy necessarily means in the improvement of the lot of men and therewith of society. I cannot. I read to you one passage which is very revealing, and somewhere some of you would not expect it, but I believe I forgot this. Oh no, here it is. And that is a passage from Pascal, the great religious writer and mathematician and physicist. He says, man is brought forth, produced, only for infinity. He is in ignorance in the first age of his life, but he instructs himself unceasingly in his progress, for he draws advantage not only of his own experience, but also of that of his predecessors, for he preserves all this in his memory, the knowledge which has once been acquired, and which the ancients have practiced in the books which they have. That is, of course, another crucial premise of the notion of the necessity of progress. An acquisition of the human mind, a truth discovered by the human mind, can never again be forgotten. That we ourselves, an individual who made some observation, may forget it is, I believe, possible. At least I can judge my own experience. But that the discovery of someone else should always be remembered by other people is extremely unevident. Even if the books are preserved, books must be understood. The physical preservation of the books is not sufficient. That is another grave premise, it seems to me, of the belief in progress. Now, but however this may be, the notion of progress culminated in this view that there is, which I will read you two quotations from Burke. Later generations will always be superior to the earlier, for progress is a natural and necessary effect of the constitution of the human mind. Statement by Fontenelle, late 18th century, early 18th, and two more. Turgot had already conceived the total mass of the human race moving always slowly forward. There is no people in the world doomed by nature to perpetual inferiority or irrevocably disqualified by race from playing a useful part in the future of civilization. This doctrine of the possibility of indefinitely molding the characters of men by laws and institutions laid a foundation on which the theory of the perfectibility of humanity could be rested. The clearest case, in other words, of the doctrine of progress is this: there is a necessity in the nature of things of a progressive movement of the human intellect as well as of human society. There could be, this thought could be given a somewhat different term. When you speak of the necessity of progress, and especially of an infinite progress, or indefinite progress, you say, of course, also the necessity of error. The same reasons which make it necessary that we know now this, make it necessary that this was unknown in the past, or that men erred in relation to that. The necessity of progress means also the necessity of error. And therefore the belief in progress in itself could very well lead to a vindication of the past. These people were not fools or criminals. They could not have thought differently. They could not have acted differently than they did. More than that, we owe it to their errors and their crimes that we are where we are. We are, in other words, we owe our best to human acquisition, as distinguished from nature. We owe our best to what our forebears did. They acquired the wisdom which made possible our higher wisdom. The doctrine of progress, which led, generally speaking, in the 18th century to contempt for the past, could as well lead to gratitude to the past. And it could lead to the proposition made in the 19th century that everything good is heritage, and not nature. This possibility of the idea of progress was drawn only, this conclusion was drawn only after the collapse of the French Revolution by the so-called conservatives. I mentioned this only possibly. Still, to repeat this one point, the necessity of progress means fundamentally, primarily in the older view, the necessity of intellectual progress and of the diffusion of knowledge. This, however, this intellectual progress and of the diffusion of knowledge and the ensuing social progress is part of a comprehensive deterministic or necessitarian scheme. The necessity of progress has no other character, fundamentally, than the character of gravitation. It's truly necessary. And LM, as I had occasion to observe. If we ask for the most obvious reason why this has happened, or at least the reasons which are visible immediately today in our academic surroundings, the first is the fact which I referred before, the certainty that all value judgments are strictly speaking non-rational, not to say irrational. And to speak of progress means to admit rational value judgment. Otherwise, it is merely an expression of your subjective preference without any solid meaning.
Isn't it possible that the idea of progress, though it's no longer an intellectual problem in the academic community, has become nevertheless something implicitly accepted and not reflected upon? Even though, in other words, in word, we may find theories of the social science today which would be a rejection of the idea of progress, but in deed and by inactivities, this nevertheless happens.
You're absolutely right. Scratch the scientific social sciences and you find belief and progress.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, but still that is very true. You know, I used a famous proverb called the Russian, the French proverb of Russians. No? Scratch the Russian and you find the trash. So scratch the social science. And I always said you find the utilitarian, but it is perfectly, I could say that. Until you have to take seriously what people say. We don't make psychoanalysis. We take seriously what they say. And therefore, when they say value judgments are absolutely rationally impossible, cannot possibly have a rational basis, that means, of course, we cannot rationally speak of progress, and except under very limited terms, where the whole question remains open. The progress of airplanes, or of rockets, or whatever have you. Yeah, but whether that is really good remains wholly undetermined. You know, in the same way you could also, in the same way in which you can speak of the progress of a disease, in that neutral way can they speak of progress.
What about social engineering?
Way disease, it has progressed. But that this is not, this is really a progress of the individual that can no longer be said. Yes.
What about the general notion of social engineering vessels? You know, the question of manipulation for...
Yeah, there is no doubt that, but here, I remember one of So book titles sometimes go, by Strauss Center, a village shows progress. So it is used sometimes by Strauss Center, but I believe it is not in accordance with the strict rules of the profession. Yeah, that it is. Good. The next point is exactly his next second reason is that historicism, of which I mentioned, we spoke before, to which I will have to come back, in which denies as such the possibility in any serious sense of progress because of the fundamental equality of all, at least of all high cultures. Yeah? For some text famous a book, The Glamour of the West. There is no possibility to say that modern Europe marks the progress beyond China or Babylon, whereas Hegel had not the slightest doubt that you could show that modern Europe is superior to China. Yeah? The recognition of the rights of man by the modern state was to Hegel part of that simple proof that modern Europe is superior to ancient China. Yeah? Even if Confucius was as democratic as some people say, there was certainly no clear legal recognition of the rights of man. And but that's today taken for granted. Who doubts, which self-respecting social scientist dares to say that perhaps the Athens of Pericles was objectively higher in rank than the Bushman in Australia? You don't know that. But let's drop this and simply reduce it to an uncontroverted thesis that the concept of progress, which played such an enormous role in the thought of the last 2 centuries, and even was still stated by a very famous American historian, Charles A. Beard, in the year 1932, is today no longer, and not only not fashionable, but really prohibited by the very principles of scientific method. The question, this much about the general problem. Why do we turn to Kant? Kant, we may tentatively say, was the first philosopher of the highest rank who discussed philosophy of history under this name. The last chapter of his Critique of Pure Reason is entitled, quote, "The History of Pure Reason," unquote. That is a very novel title. This chapter is very brief and in no way elaborated, but still it is there. It is around. The history of pure reason should be written, Kant says. But he didn't write it. And generally speaking, Kant didn't write a philosophy of history. So while he was aware of that idea, he hesitated to elaborate. There was a certain strange hesitation. You only have to contrast it with the philosophic generation after Kant. I take the example of Schelling, but there is somewhat earlier than Hegel, but in this respect not so different from Kant. For Schelling, you very roughly state this. There is the axiom, which has, that terms, 2 attributes. Say extension and thought. This attribute of extension, space, and what it means, fully understood, is nature. Therefore, one part of philosophy of nature. The other part, the attribute of thought, this is fully understood. It means history. So that the knowledge of the absolute, metaphysics, may be said to be sub-philosophy, the philosophy of nature and philosophy of history. And Hegel elaborated them. There is nothing of the kind in Kant. Why then did he hesitate? and yet not reject. Now it is impossible to answer this question, or even to prepare an answer, without having some understanding of Kant's enterprise as a whole. We will try to prepare such a very provisional understanding by reflecting on the fact that according to Kant's explicit declaration, he owes the decisive stimulus to his work to two men, to Rousseau and to Hume. Rousseau and Hume, neither of whom could be called a metaphysician, induced Kant to revolutionize metaphysics. Now let us discuss these two influences forming Kant before he became the man for which he is famous. Let's first consider Rousseau, and let us do that from the point of view of the question with which we started, philosophy of history and progress. Now, Rousseau, I limit myself now to two works of Rousseau, which were crucial to Kant, as we will see later on from some quotations. And that is the Discourse on Arts and Sciences, the first famous publication of Rousseau, and the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. The dates are in the early 1750s, 51 and 54, if I remember well. Now, what is so striking in these two books is this. At first glance, they present themselves as books denying the fact of progress. The moderns are inferior to the ancients, number one. But even the ancients are inferior because they are civilized men to the natural man, say to the savages. The whole progress was a mistake. Rousseau regarded them, that we have to say under all conditions, Rousseau regarded progress as a problematic thing. Perhaps we shall say for the time being, Kant's hesitation to elaborate the philosophy of history, or perhaps the peculiar character of Kant's ideas regarding philosophy of history, have to do with the fact that Kant was aware of a problem of progress, and he had become aware of it through Rousseau. I would like to remind you of a few characteristic points of Rousseau's second discourse, the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. This book is explicitly a history of man, i.e. a history of the human species. A history read, as Rousseau put it, not in human books, but in nature. Not in the books of men who lie, and the book of nature, which never lies. It is a history of man's transition from the state of nature to civilized life. Should there be a connection between the state of nature and the philosophy of history or the idea of progress? We must first answer this question. And for this purpose we have to consider the state of nature notion altogether, not only in its Rousseauan version, but also the version which we find in Locke and in Hobbes. In the first place, the state of nature idea takes the place, or the description of the state of nature, takes the place of the biblical account of man's origins and thereafter. That is an undeniable fact. The state of nature means this. Contrary to the Bible, the beginnings of man were most imperfect. The transition from the state of nature to civil society is an unqualified progress, whereas in the Bible the founding of the city is ascribed to Cain. And furthermore, this process from the beginning to the civil society is entirely natural, i.e. non-miraculous. The second, the state of nature became a theme within the context of reflection on the law of nature. Law of nature here in the sense of the moral law. The state of nature is a part of a novel doctrine, a novel version of the old doctrine of natural law. The traditional natural law doctrine of antiquity and the Middle Ages has no relation to the notion of a state of nature and to the transition from a state of nature to civil society. The traditional natural law doctrine is a strictly non-historical doctrine. There is a remarkable passage in the Summa Theologica, Part 1, Article 46, the question 46. Natural reason cannot know whether the world had a beginning or whether the world was always. Applied to our question, that means the beginning of history may be the perfect Adam, or may be the rude mountaineers who survived cataclysms. Aristotelian. Natural reason cannot settle this question. But however this may be, one thing was certain on the basis of the older doctrine. There are always addressees of the law of nature, by which I mean men in every stage, rude mountaineers, sophisticated dwellers of cities, are equally equipped to understand the principles of the natural law or the moral law. There are always, man is as such an addressee of the law of nature. Rousseau and Locke deny this. Man is not always an addressee of the law of nature, since all knowledge and even reason itself is acquired, and therefore man at the beginning was completely unable to understand any moral principle. It took a very long time. We will see later on that this is a very important difficulty for Kant. How was reason, and therefore how was knowledge of moral principles acquired? By a necessary process and a non-teleological process. A process not directed towards the emergence and perfection of reason, but reason was somehow an unintended product of the process. It is very difficult to find out the precise meaning of Rousseau's doctrine, because so many things which he says in his discourse on the origin of inequality are obviously taken from the Latin poet Lucretius, who in the fifth book of Nature of Things gives what people now call a history of human civilizations from primitive beginnings and so on. And Rousseau obviously borrows very much from Lucretius. But that makes it, therefore it is necessary to see the differences between Rousseau and Lucretius for a better understanding of the problem. Now, what is the difference? There is no state of nature in Lucretius. For the very simple reason, because there is no law of nature, no moral law considered by this Epicurean poet. In Lucretius' language, one would have to say the state of nature is the state of the philosopher when he is fully alive to the verities. That is the natural state of man. But this the primitive savage beginning, it cannot be a state of nature. Now, what then is the root of this difference between Rousseau and Lucretius? We see here then that the state of nature, as understood by this Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, is meant to supply a standard for the order of society. Those rights and duties, if there were duties, which belong to the law to the state of nature, are the truly natural order with the view to which we have to order our life. But the state of nature is extremely imperfect, and therefore the state of nature can supply only a negative state. The state of nature is something to get away from. But since it is the only natural state, it is the only phenomenon which gives us a rock-bottom orientation. Everything else, all really human laws, cannot be examined, and they cannot be justified except by reference to something natural. This natural, the view to which all existing organizations, institutions and laws have to be examined, is the state of nature as a certain legal status. A status in which there are rights and to some extent even duties. The state of nature idea implies, in other words, that what is really good and where good for man emerges through a break with the state of nature. The good emerges, we can say, through a rebellion against nature. This rebellion against nature, by which I mean the process of civilization, is however itself a natural process. By natural necessity, a certain part of nature, called man, emerges, which part is compelled by natural necessity to rebel against the rest of nature. The process of civilization is a natural process, but it is also not a natural process. That is the great characteristic difficulty of this position, because it is a rebellion against nature. For it requires wholly non-natural means, artifacts of a peculiar kind, to use the language of our contemporaries, verbal symbols, speech. Only that makes possible the rebellion against nature. Verbal symbols are not natural in the way in which, for example, our bodies are natural. We can also say this position is cursed from its very beginning by the necessity in which it finds itself to say that there is an essential difference between man and non-man, and also there is not an essential difference between man and non-man. We find this up to the present day. Now, what then is the characteristic, the peculiarity of the concept of the state of nature compared with Lucretius, but also all pre-modern philosophy, materialistic or non-materialistic? What man can be the master of nature. To master nature means to understand nature, in the sense that man can learn to produce better things which nature produces imperfectly. Man can reproduce nature. To understand a thing means to understand its genesis. Everything must be understood as having come into being. For example, if you take classical atoms, atoms have a peculiar shape and size. But this must be understood from the modern point of view, ultimately, as these peculiar shapes and sizes must be understood as modifications of something more primary. To take the most important example, reason must be understood as having come into being. For Lucretius, That was no problem. There are mind atoms as well as other kinds of atoms. There could be no question of a genesis of atoms. Therefore, the genesis of reason is no problem. Lucretius discusses at some length the genesis of speech. But very characteristically, Rousseau transforms this discussion of the genesis of speech into a discussion of the genesis of reason. To understand means to make, to construct a perfectly evident, as perfectly evident, i.e. as necessary. That's to say, a necessitarian or a deterministic natural science which shows the necessity of man's production, of man's changing from bestial beginnings to civilization, or in other words, man's progress. This is basic for Rousseau and accepted by him. And here we come to the difficulty, because at first glance, and not only at first glance, Rousseau denies the fact of progress and suggests, apparently, a return to that primitive bestial state of nature. What then does he mean by this flagrant contradiction? Rousseau does not deny the fact of intellectual and technological progress. He merely denies that intellectual technical progress is moral progress and progress in happiness. The pre-agricultural savages are better and happier than we, and even than the ancients, although we are intellectually and technologically their superiors. Yet, Rousseau's argument proceeds, we cannot return to this state. And above all, better does not mean for Rousseau more moral. Rousseau makes a distinction between goodness and morality or virtue. Goodness means instinctive goodness, as, say, compassion. It has nothing to do with rational principle, with a sense of duty. That belongs to virtue. Now, as regards morality or virtue, as distinguished from goodness, morality stands and falls with civil society. The emergence of civil society coincides with the emergence of morality. There are very great difficulties in Rousseau's doctrine which explain all kinds of misinterpretation. I don't know what the time is. Well, in this book which I mentioned, R.V. Sampson, Progress in the Age of Reason, you'll find a statement on page 79 which is to some extent excused by the really very great difficulties of Rousseau's doctrine. But of course, how a reasonable man could write that page, I still don't understand. And that, for example, before the ink can have dried on the first element, Rousseau had already thought of something entirely different. Well, I cannot go into that now. I would like to read you one passage of Rousseau, which is still true, and that is in a defense he wrote in the letter to Monsieur de Beaumont, then Archbishop of Paris. The development of intelligence and of vice always takes place in the same proportion, not in the individuals, but in the peoples. A distinction which I have always carefully made, and which none of those who have attacked me has ever been able to understand. Rousseau is absolutely correct. No one who attacked him has understood it, and I believe even today it's very rare that someone sees that. I cannot now give a solution of this great, or suggest a solution of this great problem of how this enormous enormous contradiction which you find in Rousseau are solvable according to Rousseau's own indications. I must, there may be a later occasion, I do not have to do that. I can only say that the analysis which I gave in my natural history, I think is still correct. I still stick to that. But that would lead us now too far. Perhaps I mention only one point. All Rousseau's contradictions, and they are famous, go back to one fundamental contradiction, which, however, was not a contradiction but an antinomy, of which he was fully aware, and which he did not state clearly on every occasion, therefore the formal contradiction. And that is that the perfection of the individual and social perfection are governed by entirely different rules. The perfect society, say Geneva, the city from which it came, Geneva, old-fashioned, severe in its manners, demanding the full dedication to the common good, a life of duty in every point, and yet there is something in the individual which cannot be satisfied by such a life of dutiful citizenship. But while for most people this life of dutiful citizenship is the highest that they can reach, there is an alternative, and this is a mixture of the philosopher and the bohemian, let us say the artist. That Rousseau is, one can say, what Rousseau has in mind. The solution of the social problem, the democratic republic as we saw it, is not only not identical with the solution of the problem of the individual, it is even incompatible with it. There must be people living on the fringes of society, who are, as it were, the soul of that society. The society as such cannot be the soul. The 19th century was struggling all the time with this problem. In a way, it is struggling up to the present day. If you take such a simple, everyday phenomenon that someone writes an indecent poem and he is brought before a judge, in California or maybe in other places of the country, then instead of punishing him for doing something indecent, they say, which would be Rousseau's idea, they say he is an artist, and that is not pornography but art. And that is an indication of the problem, where you see how the notion of art affects jurisdiction and therefore social life. That has something to do with Rousseau, and of course, but it is really only a statement of the problem on the lowest possible level, I must emphasize. Now, to come back, not to go to further into the question of Rousseau, only to raise this question. What is the meaning of Rousseau's work as regards the problem of progress? In spite of Rousseau's doubts regarding progress, his whole work leads to the consequence that with a modification, the tradition of the idea of progress is continued not only in spite of it, but because of it. I read to you one passage to indicate why I had to make this remark. Kant wrote somewhere among his papers that was not published in his life. And that is the key, not to Rousseau, although it is part, but to Kant. I myself am a researcher, if that is the proper translation, inquirer, out of inclination. I sense the whole thirst for knowledge and the greedy unrest to make progress, and also as well as the content at every progress. There was a time where I believed that this all could make out the honor of mankind, and I despised the vulgar, who knows nothing. Rousseau has straightened me out. This illusory preference disappears. I learned to honor man, human beings, and would regard myself as much less useful than common daily if I did not believe that this consideration could give a value to all of us by establishing the rights of mankind. That is what Kant, and that's not the whole story, we will come to other factors. That is, however, the most emphatic remark Kant ever made on Rousseau. Rousseau has made clear to him that the theoretical idea, as it is called, he believes that the perfection of man consists in theoretical understanding, is a delusion. That man's true perfection, if we can use this term here, consists in morality. And morality consists essentially in recognizing the rights of man, the deed, of course, in respecting the dignity of man. And philosophy and all the theoretical pursuits ultimately can be justified only by their being in the service of this moral function. Now, you see how Rousseau's attack on the idea of progress comes in at this point. Rousseau's statement in the first discourse especially, intellectual progress is not moral progress. And moral progress is the only standard of progress that was accepted. And morality is the only standard ultimately valid that was decisive for Kant. But however, this itself in no way explains, and that's the question which we have why it's philosophy of history. What has morality and the understanding of moral principles to do with history, with philosophy of history? We will take this up next time, but I would like to see, in order to find out whether I have succeeded in bringing across this point, do you see a connection between the question of moral principle and history at the level of the discussion in Rousseau and Kant's time?
The most manifest aspects of history was political history, and
but what has this to do? I mean, if we have moral principles, we judge of political institutions and political actions, and the political actions may be as criminal and idiotic as they are, that it does not affect our knowledge and the state that is principle.
Can you restate the question?
Kant learned or claimed to have learned from Rousseau the supremacy of morality. And that is so important to him that he can say, Rousseau has straightened me out. If that is the proper translation of the German word expression, Rousseau hat mich zurechtgebracht. he brought me into order or shape, would be legally proper translation. Now, so that was the epoch-making event in Kant's life. Apart from Hume, that we will discuss next time. Now, so Kant understood the status of morality. What has this to do with philosophy of history? Yes.
Well, if the state of morality is the result of this process, if morality does not emerge except as a product of this process, then an understanding, and then if Kant says, and all intellectual endeavors must be to an understanding, be in the service of morality.
No, that's a very good answer on the basis of what I said. I see now what I have to emphasize. Kant, of course, does not accept this notion of the genesis of reason. Therefore, your answer is not sufficient. But it has nevertheless to do with this question which I mentioned. Your answer must be generalized. The most important and the most fundamental phenomenon will prove to be, for Kant, the moral law. But Kant is confronted with a difficulty with which the earlier thinkers who spoke of the moral law were not confronted. Namely, with the question, are there always addressees of the moral law? This question exists for Kant. Are there always addressees of the moral law? Are the most extreme savages, could they possibly know the moral law? Now, if not, that creates a very great problem. And the solution to that problem would be philosophy of history. It would show why their ignorance is not only excusable, but redounds to the glory of God. I will read to you a passage next time. How can you see how it could redound to the glory of God? That the savages are completely ignorant of the moral law as moral law. If it is true that miracles and miraculous intervention redound less to the glory of God than natural causation, that God has constructed the machine of the world in such a way that it brings about everything without any miraculous intervention, then and only then is this a necessary conclusion. And it is for this reason that Kant compares Rousseau to Newton. For Kant, Rousseau is a Newton of the moral world. Rousseau has discovered law, regularity, where previously people found only irregularity and no sense. We do not have to go whether that is a perfectly thought out comparison. That is not the point now. But the crucial point is that Rousseau did, he means of course by the second treatise. Rousseau by his second treatise did something comparable to Newton's work. Just as Newton showed how this marvelous order of the visible universe is intelligible without any miracles entering. Perfect, some simple laws. In the same way, Rousseau simple laws had been discovered by Rousseau. Yes?
Doesn't the fulfillment of the moral law for Kant depend upon political development and technological development as well?
Yes.
Where you have a historical development coinciding with the fulfillment of the moral law itself.
Yes. That is an extremely difficult question which we are wholly unprepared to discuss in this stage, and which can be stated as follows. Can there be, from Kant's point of view, a moral progress proper? There can be a progress of the understanding of the moral law, I would assume. But can there be a progress that the next generation would be more moral than the preceding generation? they can be technologically and intellectually, they can be advanced. That is a great question. In spite of this, Kant's belief in progress is primarily in the possibility of intellectual and institutional progress. You are quite right. In a very difficult way, hard to understand, this goes together in Kant nevertheless with an expectation of moral progress. The difficulty here, you see, I mean, there is not a simple parallel. That is due to the so simple.
Well, his whole concept of moral worth seemed to it would be difficult to conceive of moral progress in Kant from very his own understanding of moral worth and estimation.
Yeah, but that is that's a very great question. But you see that the difficulty which here, that is exactly the point of the influence of on Kant of Rousseau. Whereas the general view was a strict, the intellectual progress is strictly parallel to moral progress. What does moral progress mean? Next on we are not cannibals. Why are we no longer cannibals? Because we are enlightened. Yes, we know that is better food, and that is a very unwise practice because of the fear of being eaten up and being looked over by a potential threat, and in that society altogether important, and so we know that we abolish. And now Rousseau's point, intellectual progress is itself something radically different from all. And then, of course, if this is developed fully in one direction, it means there could be an intellectual, technological, political progress of the most important kind, and yet there would be wise to Kaiser, living in a perfect, organized society with amazing knowledge of the universe and anything. Kant was aware of this problem, and he learned this from Rousseau. There is one important complication which exists in the consciousness of modern man, I think, Rousseau and the others also live on this wise dimension. And you know, those are the problem. But they are competent for the laws of the spirit. Since that was another situation, and also one can at least get the influence why the philosophy of history is for Kant a problem. Is there a possibility of moral progress? Or what does all other progress mean? It says no. Now, I think we must now stop. And only one more. Mr. How do you want to read this?
Yes.
Very good. Prepared for next time. Perhaps we have to, because